Hi, this is Dr. Dorothy Merritt, and this slide set is a little more extensive than the others. It goes to the mechanism of how does EDTA work and why is it so superior in diabetics. We're going to go through metal ion removal, especially lead and cadmium in the world, nitric oxide effect, and then diabetic physiology and why does it work so superiorly in diabetics. The textile industry needed to remove calcium during the dyeing process of cloth in the 1930s, and they couldn't get citric acid from England. So they developed a chemical called EDTA that binds up calcium. And so now, as you can see, there's over 15 to 20 types of EDTA. Only 2 are used in humans, and that's calcium and disodium. It's used in your makeup, water treatment plants, your cornflakes, blood drawing tubes to keep things coagulated, anticoagulated, and there are many, many uses of EDTA. The most controversial has been using it IV to treat vascular disease. Despite 60 years of studies and use, EDTA was still in no man's land and not approved for treatment of vascular disease. So the trial to assess chelation therapy was funded by the NIH for $32 million with Tony Lamas as the head principal investigator. And the results of this trial were a conundrum to many of mainstream medicine because here was a chemical that nobody believed worked, and yet it had almost better results than our standard medical treatments now, and especially in diabetics. As you know, in post-heart attack patients, people are on aspirin, beta blockers, statins, ACE inhibitors as standard of care, and you can see they each help 21 to 23%. But in the EDTA trial, the TAC trial, in diabetics, there was 41% reduction of all endpoints, such as death and stroke and revascularization and hospitalization for angina, 51% reduction in heart attacks, 43% reduction in death. And this is a level A class study. So there's just nothing like it that we've seen in recent or past history. This was quite a conundrum, and people needed to figure out, why did this stuff work? We proved it worked, but why? Metal toxicology has been well studied, and there's extensive epidemiological evidence showing adverse CV effects of certain metals. You can see the ones circled here are very common, like cobalt and the cobalt hips, lead, toxicity, antimony, arsenic, cadmium, mercury. All these things have had some sort of vascular effects. Well, how do metals induce atherosclerosis? Not only with reduction in nitric oxide, increased reactive oxidative species, inflammatory markers, all of these end up with endothelial injury, hypertension, atherosclerosis, and thrombosis. EDTA helps reduce all of these things. This is a large review of over 348,000 people with coronary disease, stroke, and cardiovascular disease, and their exposure to arsenic, lead, and cadmium and copper. The bottom line is cardiovascular mortality rates in the United States decreased by 43% from 88 to 2004 because a third of that reduction in cardiovascular mortality could be explained by the decline in lead and cadmium exposures in the environment. As you can see at the beginning of the century, lead in paint was the highest level of poisoning and lead toxicity. However, the introduction of tetraethyl lead in the early 40s really raised the bar, and it didn't come down until the late 1980s. So people in this period, in this age group, have been extremely exposed to lead. And the half-life in your body is decades because it's stored as in place of calcium in your bones. And it doesn't start, your bones don't start turning over in the normal aging process until your 40s, unless you're sick. And then it's 4 to 10 times faster than average. So all that lead that was accumulated during this period is coming out and causing you problems as you get older. You are your own source of lead toxicity. And cadmium has been the big thing that's the new lead, as you can see, with all the batteries and solar panels and coatings and things that people use cadmium for. This graph just shows you from 1988 to 2004 that as the blood lead levels went down in the population and the urine cadmium levels went down in the population, the cardiovascular deaths went down also. About lead levels, we're talking about blood lead levels, which are like the tip of an iceberg. It reflects the last 30 to 60 days of your exposure. In a lot of the NHANES studies that the CDC published, they used blood lead levels in their analysis. Bone lead levels are the iceberg. They predict long-term health outcomes from vascular, renal, neurological, cataracts, hypertension. 90% of the lead that you're exposed to ends up in long-term bone storage and comes out 4 to 10 times faster as it turns over after age 40. They use a bone density type machine to measure the bone, and it's only in experimental stages, so no one can practically measure the amount of lead in your bone at this point unless you're part of a national study. Two major studies came out in 2006 and 2009. It was the first time low-level lead was considered a problem, and in this 2006 study, it says low-level environmental lead is the silent killer in the U.S. And with 25% increased mortality, 55% increased cardiovascular disease, 89% increase in MI mortality, and stroke mortality was 151% increase. And this is just in the first like 5 years of the study. Then a similar study was done using bone lead studies, and it was up to 837% increase, even after adjusted for age, smoking, and race, in people that were in the top 1/3 of bone lead compared to those at the bottom. So these were very significant studies, but then they took it out 10 more years. This is the 10-year extension study that went out a total of 19 plus years from the very beginning. And as you can see, the all-cause mortality and the CV mortality went way up. And with all their statistical brilliance, they were able to attribute 412,000 people out of about 2 million that die a year, avoidable deaths. So, and most of them were cardiovascular, but all-cause mortality was 412,000 people during this period. So this shows that it is much worse than we thought. This was the CNN take on when this study came out. U.S. deaths from lead exposure 10 times higher than we thought. Back to patients that qualified for the study that were diabetic, had a previous heart attack, were given an EDTA challenge. Basically, they were given their urine was collected before EDTA and after EDTA to see how much lead and cadmium and other metals came out. As you can see, almost 4,000% increase in lead excretion, which is way over normal, and 670% cadmium excretion post-EDTA. So it shows that lead and cadmium come out with EDTA treatment, and people who are high risk vasculopaths and also diabetic have these excessive amounts of lead and cadmium in their system. 21st century lead, where does it come from now? There's natural sources from volcanoes and sea spray, vegetation, windblown dust, and forest fires, but they're, very small amount compared to man-made sources of lead, which in 1975 were 273 times 10 to the 6 tons. And then in the last 20 years, we've reduced it 91% through removing lead from gasoline and paint and other places. So you can see now that the amount of lead in the air is very low compared to back in the 80s. This is just another, this is the first ethyl gasoline station. And it just shows that paint was the big source of lead until the mid-40s. And as it came down, somebody decided to put lead in gasoline, and you can see this huge exposure from anybody born from 1940 to 1990. White house paint used to be 50% lead. Now it's down to 0.06%, but there's still some marine and bridge paint that's higher, so you have to be careful it's not completely gone. Thomas Bingley was the engineer turned chemist who put lead in gasoline as an anti-knock agent because it could be patented. Ethanol couldn't be patented, and iodine was too expensive. He also developed CFCs, that were in the spray cans, which caused depletion of the ozone layer. There were protests at the first New Jersey tetraethyl gasoline plant because 80% of the workers had psychosis or death from loony gas. And he washed his hands in front of them in leaded gas and told them there was no harm. It was in their mind, I guess. Little did anyone know he had just returned from Europe after being chelated for lead poisoning. And his untimely death was caused by some self-designed pulleys that he designed for his iron lung, and he ended up strangling to death. Discovered environmental lead when he was working on his doctoral thesis and trying to age the earth, and the uranium to lead ratio is some way that they do it. Anyway, because of all the contamination, his lab tripled the age of the earth, and so he developed the first clean lab with clean, no dust, no water, everything lead-free. And he also was responsible for the Environmental Protection Agency and many other things that took this air quality problem that caused acid rain and such, as well as lead, and got it down to the lowest levels possible. Lead is very high in Mexican candies and spices, and so certain states like Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, this stuff is commonly transported to small family markets, and people then have kids that have levels of 40 and 50. And even in the wrapper, because of the red paint or whatever dye in the wrapper, had 21,000 parts per million. So these are just some of the things. I've seen some of these at these salt things at liquor stores. And anyway, these are just some of the things that have been noted. There's lead in food. There's a lot of soil, especially like near Modena. It's very high in lead. The grapes are, so when they make wines or vinegars, they have very high lead content. Lead in water is still a problem, not because of what comes from the water treatment plant, but because of these pipes that are in the house. And if the water district decides to do chloramine instead of chlorine, it takes all this stuff and sends it right to your house. And that's happened in so many communities that it's not even funny at this point. There's so much lead. If you have an old house that has these pipes that haven't been replaced from the water line, they need to be replaced. This is a map showing lead contamination in red in U.S. soil, and it's from years of putting lead in the system. It's in the dirt and the dust. The East Coast and highly densely populated cities are the highest. And even the Boston Community Gardens, where everybody grows food stuff, has greater than 400 parts per million. When they dug the garden for Michelle Obama's vegetable garden for kids, it had so much lead in it they had to pre-treat it to neutralize it. Then you never know, you can fall out of the air, like when Notre Dame fire burned 400 tons of lead, tile burned, and spread it all throughout the city of Paris. And many children were, more than 6,000 children lived within a half a mile of these locations. Bullets are a large source of lead. Your raptors and such pick up dead animals that weren't picked up by the dogs, and then get, lead in their guts, and then they're flying around blind and lead toxic. This is an X-ray diffraction of a deer, and shot with, you can see these pellets of X-ray diffraction of lead in the tissue. So even though one bullet might have gone in the heart, there's a lot of extra lead that gets distributed in the tissue. Some people think that the answer to this is copper bullets, but I don't know. I mean, maybe it just gets you copper toxicity. I don't know. But anyway, a lot of places now use copper bullets. Shooting ranges are highly unregulated, even though there's rules and regulations, but they're highly unregulated or reviewed. This was one where they were 115 times the max over what they should have been. As you can see, if you shoot lead, you get lead back in your face to blow a cone of lead forward. So these surfaces are highly contaminated, particularly the indoor ones. A number of retained bullets, patients with retained bullets, and elevated blood lead levels are associated with that, particularly if they're near or in a joint, the blood lead levels even higher. So the NIH did about 20 years of studies on health problems and how much bone lead people had. 44% of cataracts, loss of more than 8 teeth, osteoporosis, peripheral vascular disease, heart disease, gout, abnormal EKGs, brain shrinkage, kidney insufficiency. How fast you walk has to do with how much lead is in your body. These are all things that happen as you get older. And the population that's at risk for higher bone turnover, which releases lead, are menopausal, andropausal men and women, hyperthyroidism. A lot of people who take too much T3 have problems with that. Chemotherapy, people with osteoporosis, vitamin D deficiency, were born before 1990. Remember those big curves of lead exposure that are in your bone. These are the populations that are high risk for disease and have the most lead and probably the most benefit from EDTA. Sometimes solutions are very simple. They found that lead binds to bone, right? But people or humans don't absorb fish bones, okay? The appetite or the stuff the bone's made out of doesn't absorb. So if you take a bunch of crushed up fish bones and put it in, say, a playground that is contaminated with lead because you're in a historical district and there's just a lot of lead in that, or you're growing a garden that has 300 to 400 parts per million up there on the East Coast, you can crush up fish bones, and within a few weeks, the amount of lead measurable in the soil is like minuscule. So sometimes simple things like avoidance and simple treatments like this will take care of future lead exposure, but it doesn't help you with what's in your bones now. The bottom line of any environmental toxin, including metals, is to avoid current exposure. Now with lead, there are water things you can get at your local hardware store or big box store. Instant lead testing if you're going to scrape paint. Avoid lead bullets if possible. Keep your bones from turning over. That's how you prevent the release of all that lead that's in your bones, because it takes 20 to 30 years to get it all out. If you go through chelation and stuff, that's not going to work. You've just got to get your bones healthy and not turning over. Stay exercising if you need to take one of the osteoporosis drugs, and lots of leafy greens have lots of bioidentical calcium in them. Okay, so we've talked about all the metals. Now, why does EDTA work so well in diabetics? Well, there's these things called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, and these are the things that age you. And they're modifications of proteins or lipids, and they get chemically bonded with the sugar, and that makes them die easier, okay? And they cause a lot of inflammation and things like that. So chelators, including EDTA, have been identified as potent inhibitors of these cross-linking proteins by glucose. So in diabetics, chelators like EDTA prevent aging, basically. Well, these aging products and diabetic vascular complications all go together, because in diabetes you have high sugar, high fatty acids, insulin resistance. You end up with vasoconstriction, inflammation, and thrombosis, which is vascular disease. So this is another reason EDTA, again, works on all these levels and prevents the end product here. Again, all these AGEs and RAGEs and inflammation molecules are what cause the breaking of retinal membranes and cause macular degeneration and bleeds in the retina. And so again, in one of the earlier studies where I showed the retinal membranes healing after EDTA, this is probably the mechanism. Okay, so the bottom line, or the summary of the background work on diabetics, is we know that metal pollutants are associated with cardiovascular disease. We know this evidence is, or this association is strengthened in patients with diabetes. And we know that metal oxygen chemistry is necessary to produce some of these mediators and problems. But EDTA chelates these metals involved in all of the above, and so it works on multiple levels. Now, another level that EDTA is thought to work on is it increases nitric oxide. And as you know, the Nobel Prize was shared by these three gentlemen who proved nitric oxide was the signaling molecule in heart and vascular tissue. Nitric oxide inhibits or causes oxidation of LDL, smooth muscle proliferation, adhesion molecules, platelet aggregation, smooth muscle contractions, and all these other monocyte and platelet adhesion problems. This is what I call adult acne of the artery. You get all this out of whack muscles and proliferative inflammatory foam cells, which are basically pus cells. And so the stiffer this fibrous cap is over this, the more safe you are. But if you're super hypertensive and you shear this off, then you get all this stuff released into the bloodstream in an instant heart attack. EDTA inhibits all of this. Now, this is age-associated decline in your natural nitric oxide production, which is produced in your arteries when you're under 40, basically. And it's very modifiable by diet and lifestyle. So the average person, by the time they're in their 30s, is already heading down. If they have a good exercise and diet program, it's still going down, but not near as much. And if they have a poor diet and are inactive, then this is where it is. And that's why people have so much problem. That's why after age 40 or 50, you have to exercise and you have to eat greens, because otherwise you won't make your own nitroglycerin. Now, in order to get more nitrite foods in your diet, as well as exercise, this is a list that you can go through that has the highest nitric oxide index, but greens are very important. There are beverages that have nitrates on it, like vegetable juice and Merlot, and they have all these other good things too. But anyway, this is a good thing out of a book that I have on nitric oxide by one of the NIH researchers that won the Nobel Prize, or his team did. Now, specifically, nitric oxide and lead are combined as the higher levels of lead in your blood, the lower levels of nitric oxide is available to open up your arteries. Now, this is very interesting. The book that had those polyphenols and stuff from a few slides ago with Nathan Bryan. And this is also, if you measure, this is an artery and it's spasming, this person's eating a high-fat diet. Now you see how wide and open that artery is now? This is a high-fat diet, but with nitrites, foods like greens or something added in, it reverses the effect of that spasm. This is calcium EDTA, and we know it protects versus a nitric oxide pathway too. Rats were treated with 30 minutes prior to clamping their renal arteries for 60 minutes. They were treated with EDTA, and so then they looked at the tissue after that. And in the EDTA pre-treated rats, it showed preservation of both the histological and functional kidney parameters compared to the non-treated rats, but unfortunately they didn't make it out alive either. Results in EDTA pre-treated rats showed increased nitric oxide expression, decreased inflammatory adhesion molecules, and prevention of tumor necrosis factor, which is also causes vascular leakage and inflammation. So EDTA protects immediately via a nitric oxide pathway. And that would not mean that it's taking out so much lead in a 30-minute period that your nitric oxide works again. It actually has a nitric oxide effect on the molecule. I used to use these nitric oxide sticks in the office just to show people how low people come in with migraines or hypertension or bad lifestyle or whatever. It just takes a minute to do one of these little sticks. And let me tell you that there's nothing like that. They'll go out and you can buy these sticks on the internet. There's different brands. But the bottom line is if you're depleted, there are things you can do. Exercise, you can run and then do this again and watch it turn pink, or you can eat nitrite foods and an hour later check it and see what your nitric oxide is. I just found that this was a good thing in the office to do to show what your nitric oxide does. And we used to do it on the chelation patients too, and their nitric oxide would go up. So anyway, this is just the end of the mechanisms thing, talking about metal ions, nitric oxide, and the factors in diabetes that make EDTA such a good deal.